Hello, this lecture is on the Corinthian correspondence. Actually, there are way more letters than the two that we have that went back and forth between Paul and this congregation. How do we know there were more letters? Well, in 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul mentions an earlier letter which the Corinthian congregation had received from him, but which they had misunderstood. So the first letter, called 1 Corinthians, is actually at least the second letter. In 1 Corinthians 7:1, it also looks like there was a letter from the Corinthian congregation to Paul, but we don't actually have that particular letter. What do we know about this congregation based on 1 Corinthians? Basically what is going to happen is I'm going to talk about 1 Corinthians first, and then I will break and talk about 2 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians. There's a problem in the congregation in that it is broken up into factions. At least one of the factions is led by a woman named Chloe. There's also a man named Apollos who is mentioned several times. It seems that this is a congregation that Paul himself hadn't baptized most of them, so someone else must have been serving as their main leader and the person who took care of those sort of things. The members of the congregation are what we would call blue collar, to the extent that they are neither highly educated nor of the nobility or wealthy classes, as indicated by 1:26. Is it possible that a few members of the congregation were boasting? That comes from verse 131. And if so, what were they boasting about? Some people hypothesize that they were boasting about the fact that they were great public speakers and great orators. And by contrast, Paul might have not been so hot in that arena. The word speaking, speech, or preaching, or its cognates, comes up in 1:5, 1:17, the word of the cross in 1:18, and the use of the word debate in 1:20. Now you have to keep in mind that in the ancient world, rhetors, or the people who debated, were considered to be heroes. They were your entertainment. If you wanted to be entertained for an evening, you went down to the forum and you heard a dispute where people were doing a public debate. And so the ability to do public speaking was actually pretty important in the ancient world. There is a contrast between lofty words in 12:11 and Paul's own speech in 2:4. There may also be boasting related to jealousy and spiritual gifts. Paul himself claims that he doesn't particularly speak with spiritual gifts, but he's teaching using plain old-fashioned milk rather than solid food. There are some famous passages in 1 Corinthians. First is the body parts analogy in 12:14. You might want to read chapter 12 carefully. Chapter 12 refers to spiritual gifts, including glossolalia, and the idea, using the body parts analogy, is some particular spiritual gifts are correspond to a particular part of the body, but yet a human being needs all the parts of the body in order to function. In actuality, the idea that Paul picked a body parts analogy to use in Corinth is not weird at all. And that is because in the city of Corinth there was a temple to a pagan healing god, the temple of Asclepius. And it was pretty typical for people to come to the healing god's temple, sleep overnight, and if they were healed the next day, they would commission a body part replica of whatever was healed to be dedicated to the temple. And so archaeological evidence has actually done digs where they have just found, a hand, a head, a foot, as sort of all of these body parts as archaeological remains, because they were donated to the god Asclepius in thanks for their healing in the Asclepion. So that's just a little cocktail party tidbit. Another famous passage is the love passage used at weddings, which is chapter 13. If you're not familiar with that, you might want to turn to chapter 13 and read it. And then what I call the funeral passage, or a passage that's used frequently at funerals with the hymn, "Death, where is thy sting?" In chapter 15. And you might want to read chapter 15 because you'll come across those two chapters, 13 and 15, frequently in your ministry whenever you're doing weddings or funerals. They're the passages people ask to be read at the funerals or weddings of their loved ones. Now I just want to mention a few things about the content of the first letter to Corinthians. First off, I had already mentioned that chapters 1 through 4 focus on the fact that the church was splitting into factions. Chapters 5 through 11 are about all sorts of issues related to how they should behave in everyday life. They're eating meat given to idols, whether or not they should get married, how they should handle grievances, how to behave at the Eucharist. The issues here sound like a fledgling congregation struggling to interpret how they should behave and how they should distinguish themselves from the other pagan religions who surround them in the city of Corinth. There's also the problem with women that shows up in 11:13 through 16, and I want to make a few comments in particular about this. In Paul's other letters, he doesn't seem to have any problem at all with women assuming leadership positions in the church. We can remember Phoebe, who shows up in Romans 16, 1 through 6. And even in this particular letter, he seems to correspond with Chloe's people. So she is a leader. So what about the idea that women have to keep silent? Well, some people say that the admonition for women to be silent is an interpolation. An interpolation is someone comes along after the letter has been written and inserts a passage to make it agree with something somewhere else. And in this case, a later author may have inserted the passage in Paul's original letter to make Paul's letter agree more with some of the things in the pastoral epistles. Another explanation is that it was original. Paul did write it, but he wrote it because there were some particular problems in Corinth that had to be addressed. One theory is that the congregation had a few very outspoken, very domineering women who were just causing strife in the congregation. And this shouldn't be upsetting to us. It's not unusual as pastors for us to occasionally experience serving or having a colleague who serves a church that is matriarchally driven, and so that the church is really run by one or two very strong female figures, and the pastor, if he happens to be male, is just or even female for that matter, is just a figurehead whom the church figures will come and go with the next appointment cycle, but that the matriarchs are really in charge. So it could be that that was the situation in this particular church, and just so that everyone else could have a voice, the very strong female personalities were just being told, chill, let other people get a word in edgewise here in how the church should be run and have a say in this particular congregation. Another theory put out by Antoinette Clark Wire is that there was a group in Corinth of female prophets who had spiritual gifts and were very mystical, and because they were claiming to be inspired, they were causing some unrest, and it was these particular women who were being adjured to kept silent. What about the city of Corinth as a whole? Why would it need messages about proper behavior? Well, the city of Corinth was a very freewheeling, very modern, very cosmopolitan city for its day. One might say it was the equivalent of the Las Vegas of the ancient world. And if you know that about Corinth, some of the problems they're experiencing may make a little bit more sense. I'd like to say a few words about 2 Corinthians now. 2 Corinthians is a composite ladder composed of a lot of little fragments that are actually out of order. Most scholars believe there are at least two small fragments, but others believe there are 3 and even more fragments. The most common theory, which deals with 2 fragments, is that chapters 10 through 13 are a fragment and they were written first. So the fragments are even out of order within the letter. Chapters 10 through 13 are very sarcastic in tone. Paul really takes the congregation to the woodshed here. The problem seems to be that the congregation is challenging Paul's leadership and apostolic authority, and it doesn't make Paul happy at all. Chapters 1 through 9 were likely written after chapters 10 through 13. It's friendlier in tone, and this letter, chapters 1 through 9, seems to be Paul and the congregation kissing and making up. Paul seems to be trying to reconcile with the church. An interesting aspect about these particular letters in 2 Corinthians is that it reveals a lot about Paul's personal autobiographical details, why he is doing ministry, how he perceives of his ministry, so that is very interesting. 2 Corinthians is also quite useful if you ever have a church that is in conflict, which is a pretty typical thing. In fact, the whole Corinthian correspondence, 1 Corinthians and 2nd, can be useful whenever your church blows up. I once served a church that fought over whether or not there should be round tables and square tables in the fellowship hall, and it got ugly, and I pulled out 1 Corinthians, and we had a Bible study, and we seemed to sort things out. But the oddest things will set a congregation off, and if so, it's good to have the Corinthian correspondence in your pastoral arsenal. Thank you.